Everybody, my name is Lloyd Feng from the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families, CACF, based in New York City. At CACF, I co-lead our Invisible No More campaign that advocates for the disaggregation of Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander ethnicity data at local NYC, state levels, as well as at the federal level. So a little background on CACF a little bit. So CACF is the largest Pan-Asian membership organization focused on, making sure equity and opportunity is available for our families and children and marginalized Asian Americans. And so we have 90 plus member organizations, and we also lead a budget campaign at the New York State level that organizes over 100 AAPI serving CBOs from across the state. Additionally, it's really important to keep in mind the diversity that our community organizations really serve across East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Central Asian, and Middle East and North African. Our members are doing a lot of direct services, from youth programming to job training, senior care, domestic violence services. So they really run the gamut of needs in our community. In terms of our Invisible No More campaign, you'll see on the right-hand side, we fall under the policy and advocacy team under data equity and disaggregation. So thinking a little bit more about our campaign, right? The reason why CACF over a decade ago pushed to have a really dedicated campaign presence to advocate for Asian American data disaggregation is because we realized that aggregate racial data, where it's just Asian or AAPI or AANHPI all bunched together, really masks a lot of needs that have for far too long gone unmet by different government agencies, different policymakers. It also perpetuates a lot of misunderstandings of our communities as just a massive monolith with the same needs, right? For instance, I've been in calls with legislators in my short time in advocacy where some legislators are under the assumption, right, that the Asian American communities in New York City are really just Chinese folks and Indian folks, right? And that's just not true. And so we really need this kind of data to make it clear what our needs are, to see, what is being addressed and what still needs more government attention, government care, government resources, right? And so here you'll see a diagram of some of our Invisible No More campaign's key stakeholders in relation to this data project, right? And so, we really, there's a lot of diverse groups here, right? Like different media partners in mainstream New York City, New York State media, as well as in the media from a lot of Asian communities, also New York State and New York City agencies that we work with in terms of implementation. But I really wanted to focus on New York City and New York State electives and staff, right? A lot of our advocacy is legislative and as well as implementation, right? But we work with legislators to make sure that we can hold agencies accountable. That means we have to really constantly be in contact with them to make sure they're abreast of our advocacy and what's working, what's not working. And then, so this data project really focuses on New York State electeds and their staff, as well as CACF ourselves and some of our members, right, that are also engaged with us in this advocacy. So I sort of alluded to it just now, right? But, why did we decide to pursue this data project, right? So given what I said about some of our conversations with legislators, where it was clear that some legislators don't really understand what the Asian American communities actually are, what their needs are. We also, heard from certain legislators' teams that they want to see more data. They want to understand who these communities are. I clearly remember fielding a question about, like, do you have numbers on not just Pakistani or Indian, right, or Bangladeshi, but what is the South Asian population in New York City, as well as in my district in particular? And those are questions that we actually had some difficulty answering, right, because we aren't the Census Bureau. We're not demographers by training, right? And so we found ourselves in this challenge, right, where we're advocating for this kind of disaggregated ethnicity data, but we actually can't produce it, right? So it's sort of this like catch-22 where, you know, in order to advocate for this data, some people want to see the data, and that's just, you know, it's hard. So the challenge is to, you know, the data doesn't exist, right? And we need to make sure this data is collected. And so we wanted to develop a resource that could be easy to use, easy to find in terms of quality data on the diversity of our community, as well as the disparity. And so we wanted it to be easy to understand for legislators in terms of their own district, right? So to this effort, we focused on New York State Senate districts. Of course, you know, the same thing can be said for New York State Assembly, New York City Council, and other sort of localities in New York State, right? And so we really wanted to make sure that New York City electeds and New York State electeds could really understand what these communities are. Some, you know, some legislators will have significant populations of Asian ethnic groups, others will not, right? But this is an important tool for understanding across the board. And then the outcome really should be that New York State legislators and their teams can use it to understand and develop better informed policy about the needs of our communities, and in terms of budget time, right? Making sure that funding is actually going to serve populations that have historically not received enough funding. Next slide. So some of the questions that came up for this project included some very, you know, detailed questions. You can see them here, but the biggest ones for me, right, were what about Asian regional aggregations, right? The East Asian, Southeast Asian, and Central Asian sort of breakdown. I think that, you know, we had, as I said before, right, fielded this question from different offices, and this was something that it was hard for us to produce, right? It's really hard to crunch the numbers as an advocate when there's not enough capacity, right? And, you know, we aren't necessarily trained, as I said before, to do this kind of stuff. So that's was really key for, you know, how this project started. Also, you know, where are our communities situated in relation to one another, right? Like Asian, of course, it's great to see that on a map somewhere, but it's important also to understand like Chinese, Indian, etc., Vietnamese, right? Like where are they in relation to one another, right? Where are different ethnic groups in relation to other racial groups, right? And at the end of the day, it's really about how they're doing. And so that's sort of like where the direction is going for this project. In terms of the data, so we focused on detailed Asian ethnicity population data, right, that currently exists. And that, you know, as well as breakdown of proportion of Asian populations in relation to one another. And for geography, we focus on New York State Senate districts. And then we also have been working on some census tract data at the New York State level. And as I said before, right, there's not a lot of disaggregated Asian ethnicity data, but what does exist is the American Community Survey, right? And so I took a look at 2022 data from the 5-year and then 2021 5-year data as well. In terms of some other kinds of disaggregation that we, you know, are pursuing in terms of offering, still crunching numbers on this, but age, gender, and sex, right, populations over time, we want to see, you know, how our communities are changing over time. Really want to make sure that there's a really comprehensive picture of our communities and what their needs are. So going into the actual product, so this is a screenshot from the Tableau dashboard that I worked on. So just going into it a little bit, the first part underneath the title is a little bit of information to situate the user about, you know, who made this campaign, CACF, Invisible No More, and, you know, what it does, right? So this focuses on Senate districts in New York State. And then underneath that, right, you know, we have 2 buttons where people can use to either search by an ethnicity or regional group, right, and take it to that part of the dashboard, or go by Senate district, because we wanted to provide different ways of engaging with what data disaggregation looks like at the Senate district level for our communities. I think starting with a map of New York State is really important because that's our home, and it's also pretty, and it's a really good way to bring people in, especially if, you know, they can explore different communities, right, that they're familiar with, other parts of the state that they're not so familiar with. And then going down a bit is a key term section, right? I think it's pretty important for folks to have to be on the same page about what really, unfamiliar. I mean, I was unfamiliar with data disaggregation was until I started at CACF, right? And so data disaggregation, ethnicity, they're both pretty complicated terms. And so we wanted to make sure that folks had that grounding before they engaged with the dashboard. On the right-hand side, you'll see some more buttons. And we wanted to make sure that there's enough contextualization, right, of what we're putting out there about detailed ethnicity data. I think this question of like, okay, well, we have this ethnicity data now, so what, right? Now I know that there's X Chinese, Y Vietnamese, Z Filipino in my district. Okay, what do you want me to do with it, right? And so I think part of our work is making sure that folks understand, the federal standards, right? The Office for Management and Budget yesterday announced that there are new federal race and ethnicity standards, right? And they will be groundbreaking. They will have impacts on census, right? On how federal funding is allocated, on redistricting, right? On visibility for communities like the Middle East or North African communities that have never had this kind of representation. And next is what laws, right, are related to data disaggregation in New York State and New York City. And then finally, agency CBOs that this is some information that might be helpful for like Senate staff to understand, oh, which organization does what? Are they in my district, or can this other organization get involved in serving this population that I just realized exists in our community based on this data tool? So I mentioned just now a button that would take you to learning about the laws related to data disaggregation in New York State. So CACF's advocacy with our member organizations and our allies led to this historic 2021 New York State Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander data disaggregation law. And this law, it really is New York State's first ever data disaggregation law of any sort of kind in terms of ethnicity. And it mandates that all state agencies and entities would have to disaggregate and collect data for the top 10 Asian groups by population and the top 4 NHPI groups. And it's truly historic. And so we realized that there's not a lot of information about this out there, right? We put out an FAQ. We've been doing meetings with legislators since 2021, right? And I think there's still a lot of confusion about what this law does. So we really wanted to put information about this law in one place. And then I think what's interesting about this is that I just said top 10, right? So we wanted to be able to show different senators and their teams how this law will impact their own constituents in their own district, right? So, and you can also compare by Senate district. So this is, you can see that in the little bar graphs on the bottom there. And on the right-hand side on the bottom, there are some more buttons. There's a lot of buttons in this. Because I said that this focuses on agencies, I wanted to make sure that users on the Senate side, on the advocate side, could actually see what kinds of data from agencies we've been getting, right? This part, we haven't really built out yet, but there, newsflash, is not that much data out there. Agencies have until summer 2024 to really comply and implement this kind of data disaggregation. But once it's out there, right, we wanted, even if there's nothing, I think that's important for folks to know. Why is there nothing, right? Second, looking beyond the top 10, that button we wanted to show like, okay, top 10, we can show you top 10, right? But there are districts where top 10 doesn't cut it because the groups that most need to be seen and represented in government data collection, usually smaller populations, will not be seen if the cutoff is the top 10, right? And we've looked into the numbers, it's pretty arbitrary at some level, right? Between 9, 10, 11. And it's going to be very challenging for those communities going forward. NHPI in New York State, the numbers are smaller, right? But again, it's important to uplift what their needs are. The focus of the charts and the data so far has been on Asian Americans. So I went through most of these in the 2 slides just now, but in terms of the medium, I felt it was important to make any sort of data tool pretty interactive so that folks aren't just getting a sheet of numbers, I think, we've seen that a lot, in other places. We don't want to make data disaggregation something that will make people feel bored, right? We want people to be able to understand and really go to it. Moving on to language, right? Currently, it's in English. We recognize that a lot of advocates and state senate offices, they are fine with that, right? But I think thinking about how to make this more accessible, there are a lot of community advocates in the Asian American community that use Asian languages, and I think it is important to democratize this kind of data and knowledge to our communities at a later point when we're ready. Definitions, important again to level set with folks. And then in terms of functionality, I think that thinking about comparisons, right? Like, what's going, how do we contextualize this data on my district? What is it like compared to another district or compared to different regions in New York State? That's something that's top of mind. And then printability, right? I think what's good about our dashboard is that, there are things that can be easily, screenshotted or like taken or printed out that advocates then use when they go to a budget meeting, right, with the legislator, especially if, they feel like that legislator doesn't really have a baseline understanding of what Asian American looks like for Senate District 5, for instance. So how do we intend to use this tool? Well, as I said before, right, I think we need to educate our state senators, right, and their teams. Some are already, hungry for this kind of information. So I think we have a pretty, ready audience for it. And as I said before, right, this will be a tool that can be, very interactive, or it can make for very easy one-pagers, right? In terms of how we can take this to the communities, right, and the other advocates we work with, CACF for some time has been really trying to be strategic, right, about how we take our advocacy into upstate New York, Hudson Valley, right, and Long Island, where we've heard there's a lot of need for us to work more closely with them. I think this is a tool that advocates on the ground can use. As I just said before, CACF also has a youth leadership program called ASAP, the Asian American Student Advocacy Project. They're actually really interested in data disaggregation as an advocacy concept. And so I think this tool is something that can bring in a lot of youth into our advocacy. And then finally, CACF's budget work, health equity work, and ed equity work can really, benefit from this in terms of their own sort of legislative engagement. So in terms of final reflections and takeaways, I really enjoyed, after a lot of struggle, as Selena knows, with a Tableau. There's a spectrum here of frustrating to rewarding. I definitely feel like it has been very rewarding, but there are trials and tribulations. And I think it was a real struggle to identify which angle to pursue for this project, since, and Selena and I had a lot of conversations about, just what to do, right, with this project in terms of, do we just want the ethnicity data? What else can we do with it, right? What can we say? The so what now question that I brought up earlier. And so that, I think, has been really great to think through over time. And I think we've come to a place where, I think in line with PolicyLink and National Equity Atlas, the way that they talk about democratizing the data, right, and really data justice, I think that's what we're trying to do at CACF and with the Invisible No More campaign. In terms of challenges, I'll be very quick here. The data set, right, can be the problem in terms of how the Excel spreadsheets are structured. So I actually spent a lot of time kind of, clean up these ACS data sets. Some of them are too large, some have the wrong columns. Do I make this a column instead of a row? Those sorts of questions that I'm still working through. Also, understanding how best to present different data sets in relation to one another, right? So there are some data sets that are 2021 data, and then there's other data sets that are 2022 data, right, for different things that I wanted to sort of show together. And sometimes you just can't compare apples to oranges. If it is like, Indian population from 2021 to 2022, that's fine. But if it's using like a certain indicator from, 1 year against a different indicator another year, that might, just pose a lot of challenges. And then I said before the so what now question, right? But at the end of the day, right, I think this project has really been fun to work with. There's a real utility to what we can do with this kind of data and this data dashboard we've developed. So I'm excited to continue working with Tableau. And I really wanted to thank the entire NEA fellow community here. This cohort has been fantastic and super supportive. It was great seeing so many of you in the Bay Area, and a huge shout out to Selena and the whole team at PolicyLink and ERI.